You stand on the banks of a muddy, dreary river, watching history's greatest conqueror, Alexander the Great, a legend, a demigod, conqueror of the world, is now awkwardly floundering in dirty water, desperately clinging to what's left of his dignity. No heroic battles, no epic feats, only a tedious, muddy spectacle filled with sarcasm, gloom, and bitter irony. Are you ready to witness real history, stripped of legends and illusions? But before we begin, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to see who's joining us. Now, sit back and get comfortable. We're about to start. You stand at the muddy edge of the Granicus River, trying to ignore the discomfort of the damp ground beneath your sandals. Dawn breaks slowly, like a tired old soldier rising from a battlefield nap, the sun grudgingly illuminating the sluggish movements of men and horses. A persistent mist clings stubbornly to the water, turning the entire scene into a monochrome landscape of drab grays and browns. It's exactly the sort of morning you'd expect before witnessing a historical event. Disappointing, uncomfortable, and deeply underwhelming. Ahead of you, the army of Alexander the Great, a title which sounds far more impressive than it seems at the moment, is assembling with all the urgency of people attending an obligatory family gathering. Soldiers, looking rather bored, adjust their helmets and lean on their spears as if hoping the coming battle might cancel itself due to sheer lack of enthusiasm. Macedonian warriors, famous in song and tale, appear entirely too human right now, yawning, scratching, and muttering petty complaints about the quality of breakfast or the dampness of the air. Alexander himself is perched ostentatiously atop his horse, Bucephalus, clearly attempting to project an aura of heroism and majesty. He's chosen a golden breastplate, bright enough to blind anyone foolhardy enough to gaze directly at him, and a gleaming helmet adorned with a white plume, so tall and ostentatious it seems absurdly impractical. You cannot help but feel a quiet disdain for his stylistic choices. Surely real heroes don't need so many shiny props. Yet there he is, sitting stiffly and dramatically straight backed, as if posing for some invisible sculptor determined to immortalize him in stone. You glance across the river toward the Persian army and find little improvement there. King Darius has sent a collection of provincial commanders, men who seem about as eager to fight as the Macedonians. They stand in loose, disorganized clusters, glancing occasionally at Alexander's forces with mild curiosity, clearly underwhelmed by what they see. Their horses chew absently on the sparse grasses growing near the riverbank, indifferent to the impending conflict. A few Persian warriors engage in half-hearted attempts at bravado, rattling their shields and uttering what might generously be called war cries, though they sound more like grumbling threats from tired men forced out of bed far too early. You shift your attention to the water itself. The Granicus, no epic torrent by any stretch of imagination, trickles lazily over smooth rocks. You vaguely remember tales of heroic river crossings, Great streams battled with courage and determination. But standing here, watching the slow current, you can't help but feel cheated. This is no raging river. It's a damp inconvenience, easily crossable with minimal effort. Yet both armies seem strangely hesitant, eyeing it with suspicion as if expecting some hidden treachery. A chill runs up your spine, and you tighten your cloak, inwardly lamenting the lack of historical drama. You've been promised grandeur, spectacle, and bravery. What you've gotten instead is a damp morning, two bored armies, and a river less intimidating than a large puddle. It's enough to make anyone question the value of historical tourism. Nearby, some Macedonian foot soldiers start grumbling loudly, their voices cutting through the quiet morning air with complaints about cold feet and soggy socks. You empathize deeply. No history book mentioned the trivial sufferings of damp footwear. You notice one young soldier attempting to rekindle the fading flames of last night's campfire. His efforts are so pitifully unsuccessful, you have to turn away, embarrassed for him and for yourself as a witness to such ineptitude. The trumpets suddenly blare, a noise piercing enough to startle you out of your thoughts. Alexander raises his hand dramatically, presumably to signal something momentous. Instead, his horse shifts awkwardly beneath him, nearly unseating the future conqueror of the known world. You suppress a laugh, disguising it as a cough when nearby soldiers glance suspiciously in your direction. It's comforting, at least, to know history isn't immune to embarrassment and clumsy mistakes. You hear the whispered gossip among the soldiers about Alexander's personal habits and peculiarities, trivialities that historians would conveniently leave out. You learn, unwillingly, that Alexander's obsession with appearance sometimes delayed entire marches. One particularly talkative veteran insists that the conqueror has a secret fear of mud, a detail you find utterly believable given the fussiness displayed by his gleaming attire. Your ship soon slips into open waters, and Tyre shrinks to a distant smear of white buildings shimmering in the fading sunlight. You can still hear faint sounds from the shore, shouts, laughter, the comforting din of humanity. Yet these sounds gradually fade, replaced by the lonely slapping of waves against the hull. As the first of the Macedonian cavalrymen gingerly approach the center of the Granicus, you realize you're witnessing history, the crossing that would launch Alexander's unprecedented military career, ultimately reshaping the world. And yet, watching it unfold with painful slowness, your excitement is rapidly replaced by deepening melancholy. History, it turns out, is significantly less glorious in person. The careful, reluctant pace at which the armies move feels like watching ink dry on parchment, necessary perhaps, but excruciatingly dull. Across the river, the Persians finally respond, but rather than charging heroically into the fray, they shuffle into a slightly more defensive position, as if they are irritated neighbors confronting trespassers rather than warriors facing an existential threat. You wonder briefly if battles are always so tedious when observed in real time. You glance upward at the sky, hoping perhaps some dramatic cloud formation might lend a sense of gravity to the moment. Instead, the sky remains stubbornly, insultingly mundane, a washed out gray sheet offering no support to the epic drama supposedly unfolding before you. The Macedonian trumpets sound again, this time signaling urgency that none of the soldiers seem eager to match. Alexander, sensing perhaps the unheroic tempo of his supposedly historic event, urges Bucephalus forward, visibly frustrated. His horse, at least, responds with dignity, stepping gracefully into the water. For a moment, Alexander looks exactly as the histories will later portray him: bold, fearless, majestic. But just as quickly, the illusion fades when his horse stumbles slightly on a hidden stone beneath the surface. You sigh, recognizing that history will conveniently omit this tiny, humanizing embarrassment. Finally resigned to your fate, you realize this is only the beginning of a lengthy and tedious spectacle. You're destined to witness history's finest moments, stripped bare of their glamour, reduced to mundane reality, slow, damp, and utterly unimpressive. As the mist reluctantly begins to clear, revealing soldiers now chest deep in the muddy stream, you feel your own enthusiasm fading fast. Yet duty compels you to stay. With profound reluctance, you shift your weight from one damp foot to the other and prepare yourself mentally for the next interminably long and gloomy stage of Alexander's crossing at the Granicus. You shift your stance, attempting unsuccessfully to find comfort in the mud and stones along the Granicus. Having resigned yourself to this monotonous spectacle, you watch Alexander's cavalry begin their slow and ungainly journey across the shallow river. Historians would later speak grandly of this moment: an epic charge, a bold advance. But from your uncomfortable vantage point, the reality is less glamorous, more mundane, and considerably damper. The Macedonian horses edge forward, hooves hesitant as they slip against submerged stones. You can almost sense their reluctance, their animal intuition perhaps more accurate than the ambitious confidence of their riders. One stallion stops abruptly, snorting stubbornly, prompting frustrated curses from its rider, who urges the creature onward with exaggerated theatricality. The rider's shouts sound absurdly desperate in the silence, echoing unheroically against the sleepy riverbanks. Alexander himself, still trying to maintain his dramatic composure, advances on Bucephalus, the great beast stepping into the water with reluctant dignity. The general's white plume, already laughably ostentatious, seems to grow heavier with the humidity, drooping slightly and lending him an unintended air of comic melancholy. You can't help but find irony in the moment. History's greatest conqueror, reduced by circumstance to little more than a soggy aristocrat riding unwillingly into an unremarkable stream. Around him, his companions, legendary warriors whose names would echo through history, seem similarly ill prepared. One man, clearly nervous, repeatedly drops his spear, fumbling inelegantly in an attempt to retrieve it from the murky water. Each retrieval grows more desperate and comic than the last, and you consider briefly the possibility that history itself is shaped as much by human clumsiness as by bravery or strategy. On the far bank, the Persian army observes Alexander's approach with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright boredom. They do not appear overly alarmed by the Macedonian advance, as if they too find the entire spectacle rather disappointing. Their horses stand loosely in formation, heads lowered, tails swishing irritably at non existent flies. A Persian officer, wearing overly elaborate armor clearly intended to impress rather than protect, yawns broadly, reinforcing your suspicion that even enemy commanders wish this tedious performance could be hastened. The Macedonian cavalry, meanwhile, struggles visibly. The river, while shallow, proves slippery enough to disrupt the neat formations Alexander likely envisioned. Horses bump clumsily into one another, their riders exchanging muttered curses and half hearted apologies. The once disciplined lines blur into shapeless clusters, more akin to confused flocks of sheep than to proud warriors charging heroically into battle. Nearby, an older Macedonian soldier grumbles loudly, reminding a younger companion that battles are rarely as glamorous as the poets claim. He recounts his experiences with an air of weary resignation, detailing past campaigns marked more by hunger, boredom, and discomfort than by noble acts of bravery. You listen absently, finding solace in this veteran's honest, albeit cynical, observations. He clearly speaks from experience, and his blunt realism somehow makes the absurdity of your current situation slightly easier to bear. Across the water, a sudden commotion briefly draws your attention. One of the Persian riders, impatient or perhaps overly enthusiastic, urges his horse forward to challenge the advancing Macedonians. The horse refuses outright, planting its hooves firmly in the mud, resulting in an undignified and prolonged struggle between animal and rider. Eventually, the frustrated Persian dismounts with exaggerated dignity, choosing instead to shout ineffectual threats at the Macedonian riders from the safety of the riverbank. His fellow Persians laugh openly at his expense, and you note with mild amusement that the tension of impending battle has done little to dampen soldiers' universal appreciation for comedic misfortune. Turning your gaze back to Alexander, you observe the general's efforts to rally his men. His gestures grow increasingly theatrical, punctuated by dramatic waves of his sword, which seem oddly exaggerated considering the slow pace of events. He shouts encouragement in a voice so enthusiastic it borders on parody, attempting to inspire his troops with phrases clearly rehearsed beforehand. You wonder idly if his soldiers feel as embarrassed for him as you do. There's something distinctly uncomfortable about watching a historical figure strain so obviously for greatness. Finally, one Macedonian rider, apparently braver or simply less patient than his fellows, pushes ahead, driving his horse recklessly forward. His steed splashes dramatically, water spraying wildly around him. Momentarily inspired, others follow suit, creating the first genuine sense of momentum you've witnessed all morning. But even this enthusiasm is short lived. The rider's horse slips suddenly on a hidden stone beneath the water, sending both horse and man sprawling awkwardly into the shallow stream. The unfortunate cavalryman emerges sputtering, his armor soaked, his dignity utterly destroyed. You watch sympathetically as he struggles to remount, his comrades barely concealing their laughter. Even Alexander turns his head briefly, looking away perhaps to hide his own amusement or embarrassment. This minor calamity, trivial in the grand scheme of history, nonetheless encapsulates perfectly the general absurdity of your present circumstance. The rest of the cavalry crosses with renewed caution, taking care to avoid similar embarrassments. You sigh deeply, contemplating the long day still stretching ahead. This tedious parade of hesitant warriors, annoyed horses, and damp, disgruntled generals feels endless, a far cry indeed from the heroic spectacle promised by history books and poets alike. Eventually, Alexander himself nears the far bank, still seated stiffly upon Bucephalus, apparently determined to salvage whatever dignity remains of this sorry crossing. The horse, perhaps sensing its rider's desperation for grandeur, manages an elegant final step from the river onto the muddy shore. Alexander immediately raises his sword triumphantly, as though crossing this modest stream had been some Herculean feat. His soldiers cheer obediently, though their applause sounds forced, as if they're merely indulging their leader's ego. You glance at the Persians, now decidedly less amused, finally realizing they might soon be required to fight after all. Their commander shouts terse orders, their leisurely confidence replaced by nervous anticipation. You feel a brief pang of hope. Perhaps at last something truly dramatic is about to happen. But deep inside, a small cynical voice reminds you that reality seldom meets expectations. History, you begin to realize, is mostly composed of dull, awkward moments, punctuated occasionally by brief flares of excitement that never last long enough. And as the Macedonian cavalry finally finishes their laborious crossing, reforming into lines on the muddy bank, you resign yourself once more to the uncomfortable truth. Observing history in real time may well be the least entertaining activity imaginable. Yet, here you remain, witness to Alexander's uninspiring but historically significant moment, already dreading the next chapter of this tedious epic. With a sigh, you shuffle again in the mud, preparing yourself for what inevitably promises to be another long, drawn out episode of disappointingly human warfare at the Granicus. You exhale slowly, squinting through the haze that stubbornly lingers over the now thoroughly churned waters of the Granicus. The Macedonian cavalry, having finally completed their awkward and tedious crossing, assemble on the opposite shore with an air of relieved embarrassment, like actors who've barely managed to complete an under-rehearsed performance. You feel compelled to watch, resigned to the fact that history's greatest moments often seem terribly mundane when observed firsthand. Across from them, the Persian line shifts uneasily, less out of fear, you suspect, than from sheer discomfort at having stood so long on damp soil. The two sides stare at one another like strangers stuck in an awkward social gathering, unsure who should initiate conversation. You realize that history is unfolding not through dramatic gestures or epic duels, but through subtle and hesitant movements, a truth depressingly at odds with the heroic tales you've always been told. Then, with a suddenness that feels entirely contrived, Alexander gives a loud theatrical shout, urging his cavalry forward. The charge begins, not quite thunderously, as future poets will insist, but rather tentatively, as if each rider hopes someone else might reach the enemy first. Horses shuffle forward grudgingly, riders bouncing awkwardly, in saddles slick with river water. Alexander himself charges slightly ahead, desperately trying to embody the figure of a brave hero. His plume, now thoroughly soaked and pathetically limp, flops miserably behind him, providing a fitting symbol of this entire anticlimactic day. You watch closely as Alexander meets the enemy line, prepared for the grand spectacle promised by legends. But reality intrudes rudely once again. The first Persian warrior to confront him is an overly eager young nobleman, visibly nervous and gripping his spear with exaggerated force. The Persian lunges clumsily, and Alexander, perhaps more startled than courageous, barely manages a graceless parry, his sword slipping awkwardly in his wet palm. A brief, clumsy struggle ensues as both warriors, utterly unaccustomed to the reality of muddy riverbank combat, nearly lose their footing several times. You watch incredulously, realizing with growing melancholy that you're witnessing one of history's most celebrated confrontations reduced to a slapstick routine in wet armor. Alexander, recovering faster from embarrassment than his opponent, finally lands an awkward blow, sending the Persian stumbling backward with more confusion than pain. Nearby, another Macedonian rider attempts heroics of his own, thrusting his spear dramatically forward, only to have it lodge firmly in a muddy patch of earth, nearly vaulting him from his horse. His comrades manage to suppress outright laughter, but cannot hide their amusement entirely. One of them kindly but patronizingly pats the embarrassed rider's shoulder as he struggles to retrieve his weapon from the sticky ground. On the Persian side, confusion reigns. Warriors trained for formal combat in ideal conditions find themselves slipping, tripping, and awkwardly fumbling weapons amid the chaos of uneven terrain and slick mud. You watch a Persian archer attempt a heroic shot from horseback, only to have his horse suddenly step sideways, sending his arrow flying harmlessly into the river, where it disappears without ceremony into the murky depths. Even the renowned Macedonian general Parmenion, normally a composed and dignified figure, struggles visibly in the chaotic fray. You see him angrily berating his horse, which stubbornly refuses to move forward through a particularly sticky patch of mud. His frustration is oddly reassuring, proof, perhaps, that even history's most esteemed commanders experience deeply human moments of impotence and irritation. Meanwhile, Alexander continues his awkward advance, determined, it seems, to carve some genuine heroism out of this embarrassing mess. A Persian commander, distinguished by overly ornate armor, gleaming absurdly in the gloomy daylight, charges at Alexander with something resembling bravery. The two generals clash with audible inelegance, metal scraping clumsily against metal, weapons tangling briefly as both men glare awkwardly into each other's faces. You observe, almost sadly, how their conflict lacks any sense of poetic grandeur. Instead, it's more like two angry merchants arguing over a disputed market stall. Alexander finally manages to break free, delivering a thrust which, though unimpressive, nonetheless achieves its intended result. The Persian commander stumbles backward into a muddy patch where he flails helplessly for several humiliating seconds before finally losing balance entirely and falling flat upon his ornate backside. You sigh wearily, knowing this inglorious spectacle will somehow become, through centuries of retelling, a shining example of Alexander's bravery. As more Macedonian cavalrymen filter into the fray, you witness similar clumsy displays of accidental heroism. Horses collide with comedic absurdity. Warriors drop weapons with surprising frequency, and occasional attempts at courage inevitably dissolve into undignified struggles with the stubborn mud of the Granicus's riverbanks. Yet amid all this absurdity, you sense a grudging shift in momentum. Perhaps victory, you reflect gloomily, requires no grand heroism after all, only slightly fewer mistakes than your enemy. The Persians, increasingly disheartened by their own ineptitude, begin pulling back, their initial confidence replaced by confusion and resignation. Macedonian riders, sensing opportunity despite their own embarrassment, press forward with slightly more genuine enthusiasm, driving the Persians slowly back toward drier ground. Alexander, clearly desperate for at least one truly dramatic moment, raises his sword theatrically, shouting encouragement to his weary, muddy men. Unfortunately, at precisely this moment, his horse shifts abruptly sideways, nearly unseating him once again and thoroughly undermining whatever inspirational effect his gesture might have had. You see soldiers exchanging silent glances, expressions clearly torn between loyalty to their leader and amusement at his continued misfortune. You observe with quiet resignation how the Persians, retreating unevenly, seem almost relieved to abandon their positions. You suspect many of them share your disappointment in how this supposedly epic battle has played out. No songs will mention the clumsy retreats, lost weapons, or embarrassing slips in the mud. Instead, history will weave a tale of bravery, skill, and decisive conquest. You grimly acknowledge the chasm separating heroic legend from awkward reality. The legendary wealth of Carthage quickly becomes apparent, but so does the unsettling cruelty beneath its facade. Everywhere merchants argue fiercely, bargaining with a passion that borders on violence. One particularly aggressive trader grabs your arm, shoving cheap jewelry in your face, shouting demands in a language you barely comprehend. He seems insulted by your bewilderment, releasing you with a muttered curse that promises unpleasant divine intervention. As you watch the Macedonians gather, still damp and visibly uncomfortable, you feel an odd melancholy settle over you. History, you realize, is rarely kind to those who witness it firsthand. It is far more satisfying to imagine bravery and glory from a comfortable distance, untroubled by the countless small humiliations inevitably accompanying real world heroism. You glance toward the slowly retreating Persian lines, acknowledging their shared humanity with quiet sympathy. After today's awkward spectacle, it's impossible to feel anything other than mild embarrassment for everyone involved. You realize bitterly that heroes rarely exist in reality, only people doing their best, badly, amid circumstances that rarely cooperate with their ambitions. Resigned, you tighten your cloak around you and await the inevitable next chapter of this dreary epic, certain that even greater humiliations lie ahead. You sigh deeply, feeling the weight of the dreary morning settle into your bones as the spectacle at the Granicus limps slowly toward its anticlimactic conclusion. The Persian commanders, once proud and confident, though perhaps undeservedly so, now find themselves in an increasingly untenable position, pressed by Alexander's muddy, damp, yet oddly relentless Macedonian cavalry. You almost feel a sense of pity watching them, aware that their humiliation will inevitably be reshaped into heroic tragedy by historians eager to romanticize defeat. Near the riverbank, the Persian leader Mithridates attempts to rally his forces. Dressed in armor clearly designed more for ceremony than practicality, he struggles to maintain an air of dignity while simultaneously urging his frightened horse forward. His elaborate helmet, overly decorated with absurd flourishes and jewels, tilts unsteadily, obscuring his vision so thoroughly that you marvel he can lead at all. Mithridates shouts commands with increasing desperation, but his soldiers, exhausted and dispirited, barely acknowledge him. You watch as his authority erodes visibly, disappearing faster than footprints on the muddy shoreline. As Alexander's cavalry advances, you witness an awkward but inevitable confrontation. Mithridates, still valiantly clinging to his dignity, suddenly charges forward, sword raised dramatically, though his gesture seems more desperate than brave. Unfortunately, his horse has other ideas, stubbornly refusing to obey this ill advised command. Instead of a heroic clash, Mithridates finds himself locked in a prolonged argument with his mount, who clearly prefers retreat to heroism. You watch grimly, noting how far removed reality is from the elegant confrontations portrayed in epic poetry. At last, with visible reluctance, Mithridates dismounts awkwardly, apparently deciding it easier to face his fate on foot. His soldiers exchange uncertain glances, torn between loyalty and their own instinctive urge to retreat. Alexander's riders seize the moment, pressing forward eagerly, sensing perhaps that history, messy and ignoble though it is, might finally offer them some small measure of glory. Mithridates bravely steps forward, raising his sword once again, only to find his boots sinking rapidly into the mud, trapping him in place. You feel an uncomfortable pang of embarrassment for him as he struggles futilely, his face flushed red with effort and humiliation. A Macedonian rider, sensing an easy victory, approaches cautiously, clearly wary of sharing Mithridates' humiliating fate. After several hesitant steps, he finally reaches Mithridates, whose final defensive swing is so half hearted and clumsy it barely qualifies as resistance. Returning slowly to your ship, you encounter Hannibal again, standing silently at the dock, gazing toward distant shores. His face, always grim, now shows a subtle trace of sadness, or perhaps regret. Seeing your questioning glance, he speaks tersely. Trade here is always risky. You give something small, hoping to gain something big, but often the cost is more than expected. Further along the riverbank, another Persian officer named Spithridates fares little better. Initially attempting to rally his troops with flamboyant gestures, he soon finds himself uncomfortably isolated, abandoned by men who prefer survival to pointless heroics. His horse, sensing trouble long before Spithridates himself, has already turned in preparation to flee. You watch as the officer, awkwardly holding on for dear life, is carried unwillingly toward the Macedonian lines, his own shouts of defiance quickly replaced by embarrassed curses. Alexander himself, sensing a genuine moment for heroism amid the day's humiliations, charges forward eagerly, intercepting the hapless Spithridates. Their swords clash with inelegant metallic scraping, neither man appearing particularly skilled at close combat. For a brief moment, their struggle seems oddly balanced, both leaders slipping and sliding embarrassingly as they exchange ineffective blows. Eventually, however, Alexander's frantic desperation proves decisive, and Spithridates tumbles from his horse, landing gracelessly in the mud with a resigned groan audible even from your distant vantage point. As Alexander's cavalry surrounds Spithridates, you witness an almost comic pause. The Macedonians seem momentarily unsure how to proceed, clearly expecting some sort of heroic final resistance. Instead, the Persian commander merely sits heavily, resigned to captivity and humiliation, offering no further struggle. His captors exchange confused glances, uncertain whether they should celebrate or simply acknowledge the awkward anticlimax. Elsewhere, the Persian line crumbles entirely, soldiers retreating without dignity, helmets askew, weapons discarded with careless abandon. You watch one commander, whose name history will likely forget, desperately try to rally fleeing soldiers. He waves his arms, shouts threats, then pleas, but his efforts go unnoticed amid the chaos. Eventually, his shoulders slump visibly, and he too abandons any pretense of heroism, joining his men in retreat. Nearby, yet another Persian officer finds himself cornered against the riverbank, surrounded by Macedonian riders who hesitate uncertainly, wary of another embarrassing tumble into mud. This Persian, perhaps sensing their reluctance, attempts one final dramatic flourish, brandishing his weapon threateningly. His foot slips almost immediately, causing him to lurch awkwardly sideways, dropping his sword into the murky water. You suppress a sympathetic cringe as he raises his empty hands in surrender, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and relief. From your vantage point, it becomes increasingly clear that the fate of the Persian commanders, men who woke this morning confident of their place in history, is little more than an embarrassing footnote, a sad chapter hastily glossed over by future historians eager to romanticize rather than depict reality. You suspect their ultimate legacy will bear little resemblance to today's grim, muddy truth. Alexander's soldiers now mill about uncertainly, visibly drained by their brief, awkward victory. Their cheers, when they come, sound forced, lacking the triumphant bravado later attributed to this supposed great victory. The Persians continue retreating, offering no further resistance, content merely to survive. Dignity be damned. You glance upward at the dull, gray sky, reflecting bitterly how perfectly it mirrors this inglorious battle. History, you now fully understand, offers few genuine moments of valor, instead serving as a catalog of petty embarrassments, desperate struggles, and inevitable human failures. As the Persian commanders vanish from sight, either captured or fleeing without dignity, you feel only an overwhelming melancholy. No glory remains in your memory of this place, only damp, muddy men making desperate choices under humiliating conditions. You've seen no heroes, merely humans fumbling toward uncertain ends. Slowly, painfully slowly, Alexander gathers his men, preparing them to receive congratulations. Congratulations, you reflect bitterly, that seem entirely unwarranted given today's sorry display. Yet, you know well enough that history will reshape these moments, transforming these pitiful scenes into stories of bravery and noble struggle. You tighten your cloak again, seeking small comfort against the relentless chill, resigned now to the reality that historical truth rarely matches historical legend. With deep weariness, you await the conclusion of this tedious spectacle, hoping in vain that some brief spark of genuine dignity might yet redeem the dreary proceedings unfolding at the Granicus. You stand silently by the Granicus, the battle now fading into an exhausted quiet. The morning, which had started as a tedious and damp spectacle, concludes in a melancholy haze of resignation. You reflect bitterly that victory, when seen up close, is neither glorious nor triumphant, but simply exhausting. The Macedonian soldiers shuffle aimlessly along the muddy shore, their faces marked by fatigue rather than pride. The historical significance of the day is entirely lost on them, replaced by more immediate concerns of hunger, wet armor, and sore feet. Alexander himself strides along the riverbank, desperately attempting to project an air of confident triumph. Yet, even from this distance, you clearly see the cracks in his bravado. His elaborate helmet, once gleaming brilliantly, now sits askew, the drooping white plume soaked through with mud. His armor, splattered with grime, no longer shines heroically, but rather drips pitifully, a clear metaphor for the day's anticlimactic events. Alexander appears, despite all attempts otherwise, profoundly human, merely a weary man burdened by victory rather than energized by it. Around him, his commanders gather awkwardly, their faces betraying the fact that today's battle has been more embarrassment than conquest. You overhear snippets of conversation, complaints about the cold, the wetness, and lost weapons mingling with subdued congratulations. None seem particularly eager to celebrate. They look around as if wondering if this drab riverbank is truly the legendary site where history was supposed to happen, or if perhaps they've mistakenly wandered onto the wrong battlefield entirely. You observe quietly as Macedonian soldiers pick through the debris left by fleeing Persians. They move sluggishly, performing their duties with minimal enthusiasm, occasionally pausing to examine objects of dubious value: a dropped spear, a ruined helmet, a muddy cloak. Each discovery is greeted with a tired shrug rather than excitement. You realize suddenly that the spoils of war are just as uninspiring as the battle itself, ordinary items left behind by defeated, ordinary men. Further along the riverbank, prisoners sit resignedly in the mud, their faces reflecting quiet acceptance rather than fear or anger. You watch as Macedonian guards, equally uninterested in their role, make half hearted attempts at vigilance. One Persian prisoner, remarkably untroubled by his capture, calmly chews on a piece of stale bread provided grudgingly by his captors. His weary indifference is a stark reminder of how quickly and easily people accept their circumstances, even defeat. The scene of quiet despair is briefly interrupted by the arrival of messengers, galloping awkwardly on tired horses, bringing updates that seem entirely irrelevant given the palpable lack of interest. You hear snatches of news regarding troop movements, minor skirmishes elsewhere, and vague reports of Persian resistance, all of which fail to stir even the slightest enthusiasm among the weary soldiers. Alexander listens distractedly, his gaze drifting absently toward the river, perhaps contemplating the dreariness of victory itself. You feel an odd, uncomfortable connection with him in this moment, recognizing that behind the veneer of history's greatest conqueror is merely a tired man burdened by ambition and forced to endure victories far duller and more disappointing than legends suggest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a faint drizzle begins to fall, adding yet another layer of gloom to an already miserable morning. The droplets patter softly on armor, helmets, and shields, mixing indistinguishably with the mud and dirt already coating everything in sight. Soldiers groan softly, pulling cloaks tighter around their shoulders, clearly resenting this final insult from an uncooperative world. You glance again at the defeated Persians, who now appear oddly content, sitting in the drizzle. Perhaps defeat, you muse bitterly, offers more immediate comfort than victory. At least the defeated can rest, free from the demands of glory or ambition. The Macedonians, meanwhile, still carry the heavy burden of expectation, obligations to celebrate, rejoice, and document heroism that has stubbornly failed to materialize. Your gaze returns to Alexander, who now stands alone, staring silently across the water. You wonder briefly what thoughts run through his mind in this moment. Perhaps doubts about the worthiness of conquest or reflections on the absurdity of heroism. You suspect, cynically, that his thoughts are less grand. likely worries about wet boots, the discomfort of damp clothing, and the annoyance of ruined armor. As time drags on, soldiers drift away from the battlefield, dispersing into smaller groups where conversations turn inevitably to ordinary practical matters. You overhear men discussing where to find dry wood for a fire, how long it might take their boots to dry, and whether food might be found nearby. It occurs to you, depressingly, that these mundane concerns will never find their way into histories of the Granicus, despite being far more truthful and human than any tales of bravery or heroism. Nearby, a young soldier attempts to wash mud from his helmet, sighing audibly when it becomes apparent his efforts are useless. He tosses the helmet aside with quiet frustration, resigning himself to future discomfort. Watching him, you realize that history remembers only victories, never the small indignities that fill the long hours before and after battles. This truth saddens you more profoundly than you'd anticipated. Eventually, Alexander rallies briefly, instructing his commanders to prepare the troops for departure. His voice, now lacking all previous theatrics, sounds hollow and exhausted. The commanders nod obediently, clearly relieved that this tedious morning is finally nearing its end. Soldiers stir reluctantly, assembling into ragged formations, moving stiffly as though aged prematurely by the dampness and monotony of this dull victory. You watch as the Macedonian army slowly begins its march away from the Granicus. The Persians, left behind, seem almost indifferent, resigned to the uncertainty of their fate. The battlefield, once crowded and chaotic, gradually empties, leaving behind only mud, discarded weapons, and scattered belongings, quiet testimony to the dreary reality of war. Left alone, you gaze at the riverbank, noting how quickly even momentous places revert to quiet insignificance once the human drama subsides. You realize with bitter clarity that historical events derive their meaning entirely from the stories told afterward, rather than from the uninspiring realities witnessed firsthand. A gentle wind picks up, carrying away the last remnants of mist, leaving the Granicus exactly as it was before, slow moving, muddy, entirely unremarkable. You feel strangely cheated, understanding now that legends of Alexander's heroic crossing will bear little resemblance to the dreary, muddy affair you've witnessed. Turning away, you slowly leave the battlefield behind, burdened by the melancholy truth that history, stripped of embellishments, is nothing more than an endless procession of tedious moments, punctuated occasionally by awkward attempts at heroism. The Granicus, like so many battles before and after, will become grand only in retelling, its true nature forever hidden beneath layers of exaggeration and myth. You walk quietly into the distance, aware that nothing witnessed today has lived up to the grandeur promised by legend. History has offered no heroes, only tired, ordinary people struggling through uncomfortable and tedious circumstances. As your footsteps fade away, you feel certain that someday others will stand here, staring at these waters, imagining battles far more heroic than reality ever allowed. but you will always remember the truth, the muddy, melancholy truth of Alexander's crossing at the Granicus.